Welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 1221, and it is entitled Facts You Should Know About Willpower. And it was written by Leo Markun, M-A-R-K-U-N, Markun. This is part 2. We left off at the top of page 16, and off we go. Hence the legal distinction arises, which is sometimes made between a murder committed in the heat of passion, and one done after premeditated design, with malice aforethought. The husband cited in the preceding paragraph, if he were to kill the man whom he found in his wife's arms, might escape on the ground that an unwritten law excused him. Otherwise, he might be convicted of manslaughter or murder in the second degree, because of the idea that he acted upon impulse, that he had no time to weigh motives, but was forced by his jealousy to kill the adulterer. And yet, if his jealousy, gradually growing within him, had made him seek out the man to kill him, his crime would no doubt be considered one of first-degree murder. Do we, in general, act only after mature consideration of all the necessary consequences of our actions? Surely not. To do so would be to paralyze ourselves. Shakespeare's Hamlet is frequently taken as typical of the reflective person, the man who is so busy thinking that he has little time or energy left for getting things done. But even the thinker acts most usually upon impulse. Hume contended that reason can have no original influence on the will, for reason is either the abstract deconstruction of relationships or else the discovery of cause and effect. The will has to do with sensible realities, and not with abstract relationships. Employing a bold figure, Hume tells us that the ideas are themselves the actions, the stage, the spectators, and the play. We need not go quite so far. At times, abstract reasoning does lead to a course of action, it appears. Without attempting to analyze the nature of consciousness or to criticize the reality of thought, we may differentiate between acts which arise out of a sudden, seemingly irresistible impulse and those which follow a rather long conflict of ideas, impulsions, and inhibitions. Even the Hamlets, I have just said, carry out the promptings of a momentary and hardly explicable motive rather than those of a well-balanced series of reasons for one course of action and another. Let us follow Mr. and Mrs. Jones to the automobile show, where they are to make up their mind if a Stumbler 6 or a Rump Wire 8 is to be their next car. The salesman's discourse about torque and horsepower and vibration and hydraulic brakes. They shake the vehicles violently to prove how smoothly they run along rough roads. They set their model chassis going and their balanced crankshafts upon their wrists. Mrs. Jones is not paying any great attention to all this. That nickel trimming on the rump wire fascinates her. True, the Stumbler is cheaper, and it probably would be more economical to maintain. But it would look cheap. People would turn around to look at the rump wire. Mrs. Smith would not be able to look at her sports roadster with such an air of triumph. Yes, the rump wire would overshadow it, without a doubt. Here we have Mrs. Jones convinced and willing that Mr. Jones should buy the more expensive car. Mr. Jones will be willing the same thing soon, even though he knows he cannot afford it. But he feels tempted, and the impulse to please his wife will quite turn the scales. On the other hand, the well-developed adult is able to overpower many passing whims and impulses. I imagine there are many people who feel like shooting off all the revolvers they see, yet they manage usually to walk by without touching the firearm or to do their shooting, only in the proper manner and at the right time. Persons who are unable to resist their obsessions are socially dangerous and are considered insane. Volition arises out of the interplay of more or less unconscious forces. People seldom know why they have done a given thing, though I have given a definite reason why Mrs. Jones decides that Mr. Jones should purchase a rump wire 8, and though I have seemed to say that she understands the reason for her choice, I do not wish to imply that she is altogether consciously aware of it. She probably would point out to Mr. Jones that the better car is cheaper in the end, since it requires fewer repairs and brings a higher price in the second-hand market. She would try to convince herself that her motive is ultimate economy, and no doubt she would succeed. Undoubtedly, the feelings are dominant factors in all volitional processes. The will cannot influence the feelings, however. Thus, the young woman who feels sad when she sees a blind beggar is likely enough to drop a coin into his outstretched hat. She is unable to suppress the feeling of sadness through any volitional movement. But if she gives her attention elsewhere, if, let us say, she is talking to the young man with whom she is in love, she may easily pass the beggar without feeling sad and without giving him an alms. There are people, as we know, whose sentiments often fail to lead to action. They can be very sorry for the poor without attempting in any way to help them. They can be very indignant about one or another matter without attempting to set it right. They are happiest when reading a cheap novel or weeping over an unfortunate moving picture heroine, for then they cannot possibly be expected to do anything about their feelings. In the world of reality, unfortunately, there are all sorts of difficulties in the way. To help the poor, they must take something away from themselves. They must be prepared to face the jeers of their acquaintances. At least they must do certain definite things with their muscles. It is so much easier simply to be sorry and indignant, or to be glad when virtue triumphs. In our popular fiction, the hero seems a man beating his horse and promptly gives the cruel fellow a thrashing. Or he sees the villain maltreating the heroine, and he immediately engages in a fight. His indignation is quickly translated into action. Most of us, even if we are not cowards, do not hurry so. There is such a thing as minding one's own business. Besides, the lady to whom the rough fellow is speaking in a surly tone may be his affectionate wife. Appearances are notoriously deceptive. The Quixotes rushing in without any reflection to conquer windmills are likely to be just about as ineffective as the Hamlets sickened over their thought. The Quixotes do more, but many of the things they do had better be left undone. There is no virtue in doing the wrong thing, or in doing the right thing in the wrong way. What is right and natural for one man to do is wrong and unnatural for another. To take an obvious example, if a good swimmer sees a child drowning, we expect him to plunge in at once and do what he can to save her. If it is an indifferent swimmer who comes along and the waves are running high, he may be tempted to call for somebody else to do the rescuing. Or he may row out after her in a boat. It is also possible that he should, without much reflection, jump in. Perhaps he is able to save the child, in which case he may or may not survive himself. Perhaps both he and the child drown. In any case, he is considered a brave man, whatever may be said about his judgment. One who knows nothing of swimming is not likely to dive in. If he did, we should be inclined to call him foolhardy rather than courageous. The non-swimmer may be a brave man. He may be extremely willing to rescue a drowning child, but his power of will is not enough. He must also have acquired the proper muscular control. He must have learned how to do the thing which he is desirous of accomplishing. It is proper that this idea should be emphasized here. Most New Thought books seem to imply that a mighty will is of itself sufficient to move worlds. Volition is not magic. It acts through machinery or means. It cannot be cultivated singly and apart from the other intellectual and muscular faculties. Power of will does not vary precisely with strength of body, yet it depends upon it to a great extent. The ascetic is more readily tempted when he is tired, than indeed his conscious will, and the system of inhibitions he has built up are largely replaced by his unconscious desires, by the impulses which press upon him because he is a man and a living being. What becomes of a mighty will when its owner is asleep? And what becomes of the volition when the willer enters into his final rest? Men have attempted to answer these questions, to be sure, and well might we inquire what becomes of the whole when the donut is eaten. It is difficult for people to conceive that the self is no different from external organisms, especially with regard to indestructibility or immortality. I will to live forever. Therefore it is certain that I shall live forever. Is probably poor logic, even if the argument is convincing to many. No will is omnipotent. A man who makes up his mind to be township constable admits to himself the possibility of failure. When he makes up his mind that he ought to and will live for ages without end, though it is another matter. The undiscovered bourne whence it is certain no traveller's return offers consolation for the meek and the spineless. The term self is sometimes applied to less than the complete organism. We are told that the self or the will contends against the so-called baser instincts. If we wish to personify the various component impulsions, it is better to speak like A. E. Hausmann, who tells of the people through whose veins, in ice and fire, fear contend with desire. Not the will or the self, but one part of the self, fear. Anyone might say, with Hausmann's here, others, I am not the first, have willed more mischief than they durst. At times, too, we will more virtue than we dare or are able to carry out. There are two elements in what is loosely called willpower: the power to choose and the power to carry out the chosen course of action. Both depend upon education. The child cannot choose intelligently until it has learned the meaning of the presented alternatives. It cannot act intelligently until it has trained its muscles. As for the lower animals, they can hardly be said to display any volitional activity at all. The dog decides to fight a bigger dog or to flee from it almost automatically. In pretty much the same way does the chair which is balanced on its hind legs make up its mind to fall backward or forward. Here the forces which are at work are comparatively simple. Those making the dog move forward or turn and run are more complex indeed, yet there are no doubt interpretable in terms of biochemical and physical laws. When we set aside the human being and say that he alone has a will, we mean only that the phenomena are in his case vastly more complex than they are in the case of any lower animal. The rudiments of will exist far down in the animal scale. The amoeba is constantly in motion. If we may say of a cat that it wants to go from one place to another, we may say the same thing of the one-celled creature. Both are largely impelled by forces which direct them where they may secure nourishment and escape death. Certain philosophers and philosophical psychologists consider the human will different in kind from anything pertaining to the lower animals. William James asserts that moral action is action in the line of the greatest resistance, and that is made possible because the will, in influx of energy, assists the ideal impulse. This is itself inferior to the native evil propensity. All this does not seem to be in accordance with the newer and more scientific psychology. In fact, the tendency is to consider will as identical with conscious attention. We let one idea dominate, and this idea leads to a certain course of action. As we know, it sometimes seems to take great willpower for a child to keep looking at its textbook, especially when something happens to distract its attention. A fire engine is heard, and of course every healthy boy looks up from his arithmetic or his geography. As I sit at my desk and write, my great task is to keep out distracting ideas. If I were hungry, it would require a considerable effort of the will to remain sitting here. The hunger would express itself probably in a series of muscular movements leading me in the direction of food. Unlike the amoeba, I am able to resist such an impulsion, at least for a while. The drunkard has a great craving for drink, yet the drunkard who is penniless is not likely to go to the saloon. He has memories, past experiences, which teach him that the barkeep will not give him any liquor without payment. Or perhaps he has a valid recollection of the time he was thrown violently into the street because he drank some whiskey for which he was unable to pay. Thus he willfully suppresses that which would be immediately pleasant because it would be followed by something very unpleasant. Sometimes a man chooses the less pleasant of two alternatives simply because it is habitual. Habits are wont to be stronger than pleasure-pain motives, stronger than willpower. I shall not deal at length with the voluntary control of habits here, leaving the matter for other little blue books. Yet it is well to emphasize the fact that willpower means first of all self-control. Until the organism can control itself, it can do but little by way of changing the environment about it. Chapter 2. Free will or determinism. Much of the traditional language of psychology appears to be based upon the idea that the will is free. For the moment, let us conceive of free will as an unlimited liberty of choice. But, in this sense of the word, obviously no man has a free will. Even if I should desire to explore a distant star, I should be totally unable to do it. I do not possess the necessary technique, and I have no means of acquiring it. I have no magic carpet, and I have no acquaintance with good fairies, who might be able to furnish me with one. I have no projectile capable of firing me to Sirius. Perhaps the example is too fantastic. Very well. I simply will that Mr. Hadelman Julius should send me $1 million in payment for this little book. If I were a hypnotist, perhaps, but I am not. There are cases, indeed, in which one man can make another do his bidding. The slave obeys his master. The convict does as the warden bids him. The free workingman obeys orders also, unless the thing he is told to do seems more disagreeable than losing his position. The old fool does all he can to satisfy his young bride. But if the master is free, the slave is not. Hence, said Epicurus, we will allow those only to be free who do not endure captivity, but, as soon as they are taken, die and escape. The free man, according to this doctrine, always remains free. But it is very limited. But it is a very limited sort of freedom, which Epicurus allows. The newly captured man may choose to live rather than to die. Actually, he is permitted to choose between an X and a Y, which are both thoroughly distasteful to him. He would rather choose Z, to live and yet be free. And I think we'll stop there for part 2. I'll see you in part 3.